Hi everybody, I'm here with Stephen Hickman. So, as someone who's illustrated hundreds of book covers and worked within scores of fantasy and science fiction worlds, which worlds have you found the most interesting to work in, and what kinds of worlds inspire you the most?
Right offhand, the best and most long-lasting series that I've done would be the shared universe of Larry Niven and the Man Sin Wars covers. I've done, oh good Lord, 25 years worth of covers, and that comes to, I think there's 14 or 15 of them now.
Okay.
That's the longest series that I've ever done, and the stories are absolutely amazing. It is easily the highest quality writing. People have to give like a percentage of their money to Larry Niven, of course, for using his universe. So it's all about the inspiration and just the work for its own sake. And the stories are brilliant, and I've had a lot of fun doing the covers.
So tell me a bit about the Lemurian stone and the Farzar mythos. What was your inspiration for it, and how do you try to make that world stand out from other fantasy worlds?
I was doing, like I mentioned, a lot of the old fantasy reprint work from back in the 50s. And let's face it, writing has come a long way. And I've been reading the stories of Clark Ashton Smith and some other brilliant fantasists. And I was diligently reading all these manuscripts, and I was getting really impatient. It was just exactly like Edgar Rice Burroughs reading the pulp stories when he was doing proofreading for advertisements. He goes, I can write as badly as this. Well, this was, of course, 1915 when he was reading that. And like I say, things have come a long way. But there's some classics like A. Merritt, people like that. And that's what I've been reading. So I'm like, wow, I bet you I can do something different. Because it seemed to me a lot of the current writing, and still is based on a world experience of going to Ren fairs. So you have all these medieval fantasy worlds that are set in Europe, and you have, at their most imaginative, you have some elves, and they can be silly elves, and sometimes they can be mean elves, The Celtic elven world is really creepy. You've got these sort of, the good elves are sort of like, indifferent to, what happens, and then you've got the other half that are just malignant, and they're creepy, and they're just wonderfully, there's poetic possibilities here. Anyway, I decided to do one based on a fantasy of an Oriental setting. I made up a subtropical fantasy world and just created the whole thing. And there are some writers that I know that notice everything and are brilliant enough and talented enough to take all this observation and turn it into something just incredible. Larry Hama, for instance. Amazing writer. And since I sort of go through life and not notice anything, I just made it all up. But I based on some impressions. My dad was in the Foreign Service, and we spent some time in some exotic places. And I drew on that for the imagery.
All right, so this is a map that you created for the Lemurian Empire as part of the Farzar mythos, right?
Well, when you're creating a fantasy world out of whole cloth, so to speak, it's important to give the reader some kind of anchor or some kind of idea. You could postulate that this world would exist on Earth, say, hundreds of thousands of years from now, when science has become magic and has devolved into a state of feudal kind of Oriental despotism, and it was based loosely on some of the precepts of Niccolo Machiavelli called the Prince, where on the scene you have to have various princes around because of the speed of communication and so forth, but I'm using telepathy so that you have a centralized government and communications via telepathy with parts of temples all around. And creating the names
Yeah.
and collecting the names and generating the names is as close as I could get to Tolkien's genius with names. The sole criterion for a fantasy story is how imaginative it is. And that's how deeply creative it is.
Mm-hmm.
And since by its nature it can be anything, and since by its nature there already exists so many stereotype images, I mean they can be archetypal images, very powerful images that have existed since men were able to talk, but at the same time that's what makes Tolkien a genius, is he could take an existing stereotype like elves and make something absolutely sublime out of it.
Right.
And there's no one else that can do that.
Right.
Because he created his own languages and his own million-year backstory. You can't do better than that,
Right.
unless you happen to have that same genius for language that he did. Okay, so you have to get away from that kind of thing and just make up your own whatever is the way I figure it.
Right.
But if you look and you pay attention to what's actually there in the form of Celtic mythology and so forth.
What do you think are some of the best sources for inspiration when it comes to visually inventing things that don't exist?
Oh, no question. You go back to nature. You look at nature and look at natural forms. And you study anatomy. Whoops. That was clumsy. If you want to learn to draw, you have to learn to draw people. And to draw people, you have to learn how to draw a skeleton. And to draw animals, you learn to draw a quadruped skeleton. And it's not as complicated as it sounds. There's only two basic skeletons, apart from reptiles and fish. But if you learn those, that is the basic structure, and that's your range of movement, and that determines how you're able to put things together. You learn how to draw those basic structures, and you look. If you're drawing a dragon, look at pictures of lizards, those specialized scale patterns.
Mm-hmm.
There is a beauty to that phi ratio. If you're aware that there are fractals and phi ratios in the world, it sort of helps crystallize your being able to observe things. You can look at things from a more educated viewpoint. There are rhythms and structures in the world that are beautiful. But, on the other hand, if you want to create a convincing fantasy creature, you don't put bat wings on a gorilla, or you don't put bat wings on a lizard and call it a dragon. You make up things.
Mm-hmm.
You use that basic structure and then you extrapolate on it.
Mm-hmm.
Use that as a springboard and step off from there, and you're well on your way. But nature's always ahead of us in the beauty and infinite. Look at insects. Oh my God, orchid mantises. Look at the reptiles. These rainbow boas. Even the humble horned lizard. If you look at the specialized scales up close, we used to catch those things all the time in Texas. You didn't even have to keep them as a pet. Just picked them up for a while and until you get tired, and you just put them back down on the ground. One of the earlier sources of inspiration, I swear, when I was a kid, was putting together models of those Century Series fighter planes.
Oh, cool.
My God, functional beauty, the design, the power of these things was so incredibly like the F-101 Voodoo. You still look at that thing and go, good Lord, look at that. The F-105 has this spaceship shape.
Yeah.
My uncle was an engineer for Lockheed his entire life. Worked on the F-104 as his first project. He was part of the electronics engineers that worked on those systems. Man, this stuff is straight science fiction.
Sure.
And you watch this stuff being put together, like, speaking of Lockheed, the SR-71. This thing, it was designed in 1962 with slide rules, and they had to create an entire industry for this. Straight science fiction. but you develop a series of personal images that are important to yourself, and try and steer the story around to something, or illustrate an aspect of the story that you've got, that in a way that's most important to you, as far as an image that means something to you, because what you're doing is selling a book, and you're doing a little poster. It's like a little movie poster for this book. And it's my firm conviction that your audience responds to something that's like an honesty or a truth that is transmitted to them on a subconscious level. Even people that are not educated in art still have a very strong resonance with this kind of quality.
Right.
And people will interpret this as saying, I don't know anything about art, but I know what I like. Everybody responds to things like that. And according to psychologists, you're absorbing much more information than your conscious mind is processing. And I think a lot of this goes on a subliminal level. You're not being tricky like subliminal advertising, you're just being honest.
Right.
The element of light has a fascination that I actually sparked from something that Norman Rockwell wrote about. When he has trouble thinking of an idea, he starts off with a lamp, and then has a drunken sailor leaning on the lamp, or somebody lighting a cigarette under the lamp, or two people talking under the lamp, and then just takes it from there by way of drawing, and just lets it sort of automatically draw. Well, I can't be bothered with that, because I have more ideas than I can use. He was doing Saturday Evening Post covers anyway. But this thing of the juniper, junipers fascinate me because they have this smell that just sort of evokes something in me. It's just an otherworldly kind of a thing. You know how scents evoke images.
Sure,
it's the most powerful kind of sort of time machine.
Yep.
So I invented my own plant. Now this is a little darker than I'd like it to be, but by God, that's some beautiful painting in that. I just love that.
I agree.
You know, if I do something that's actually worthwhile, it's like somebody else painted it. You know, I couldn't have done that. And making up the costumes and so forth. You know, and birds, anything transcendental, anything with wings.
Yeah.
Wings are fascinating. Wings have to be right. So
Well, this also shows your use of golds, which I think is something that I always noticed in your work. You have a really great grasp of sort of golds and yellows that I think is not as easy as you make it look. You know.
Oh, painting gold is the greatest way to drive yourself insane that I've ever come across. And my fascination with gold and reflections got explained to me by Aldous Huxley in one of his essays. It was either Heaven and Hell or The Doors of Perception, in that it suggests a higher realm to your superego or something. I forget his description. He had the facility for describing implausible things in concrete terms and making them sound good. And besides, you can evoke Aldous Huxley's name and sound intellectual. And so that gave me a good excuse for painting gold. I can trot that one out in a conversation and watch people's eyes glaze over. What I did was just make a list of things that I liked. You know, how can you miss on that? Just make a list of the things that you like best. When I was a kid, I was fascinated with parachutes. You can see a picture of a parachute over there. Just make a list of everything that you think are fascinating. Rainbows, dragonflies, lily pads, various exotic birds, gold domes, exotic semi-tropical landscapes, mountains with cloud shadows, on and on and on.
And I think that's the key point that I try to make to students, especially in the field of concept art and in illustration as well. It's like you're tasked with coming up with all this amazing new stuff, and you have to look inside and look at your own influences, and that stuff flows out and becomes these new ideas that people have never seen before. Well, listen, I really appreciate it. This has been an awesome conversation with you, and I think the students are really going to enjoy a lot of the stuff that you had to say, and I think it's been very inspirational.
Well,
Thanks
I
a
hope
lot,
so.
Stephen.
Sean?